Welcome to the 39th National Forum, Health, Biodiversity, and Climate, a Path for a Livable Future. This is the third in a three-part series, today focused on the climate crisis. I'm Jay Feldman, Executive Director of Beyond Pesticides. As we as a society and world community struggle with the changes that need to be adopted to meet the challenges of the climate crisis, there is a bright light. Ways of treating the earth and living with nature that provide for a livable future. When we organized this session on the climate crisis, we recognize that this crisis is part of a constellation of crises that intersect. Whether we are talking about health, the health crisis born out of chemical-induced diseases, the collapse of life-sustaining biodiversity, or the dramatic catastrophes caused by the greenhouse gases and rising temperatures, the interconnectedness of the crises requires strategic solutions that are holistic and nurturing of our relationship with nature, a relationship we have minimized as a matter of policy and practice. The data on climate calls us to be audacious in our demands for urgent change in our households and communities and from decision makers at all levels of government. At Beyond Pesticides, our audacious goal is to ban petroleum-based pesticides and fertilizers in 10 years and transition to a society and world committed to organic management practices. To do this requires a change in public understanding of what's possible, and it will take a fair amount of public outrage that we are not moving fast enough to embrace the goal in all sectors. Leveraging the science, we need to show with hands-on examples what change looks like. That process has begun, and today we will hear from some of what's possible now, but the change will take people working together locally across the country and around the world. The audacious goal is achieved through on-the-ground work that becomes mainstream. If we buy or grow food, use a park or playing field, buy consumer products, advocate for change, hold elective office or advisory positions, we all play a critical role. Our work at Beyond Pesticides offers daily insight into the destruction that is being wrought by holding on to practices and toxic chemical dependencies that are defined by piecemeal approaches, antithetical to holistic thinking. As a matter of policy, we're neither preventive nor precautionary. We too often accept the underlying premise of statutory and regulatory frameworks that have been created with this thinking, the thinking that has brought us to this moment of existential crises. Many see the solution in building resilience and apply a narrow definition of the word. In the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC report, Climate Change 2020 Impacts, Adaptation and Vulnerability, they write, quote, resilience in the literature has a wider range of meanings. Adaptation is often organized around resilience as bouncing back and returning to a previous state after disturbance. More broadly, the term describes not just the ability to maintain essential function, identity, and structure, but also the capacity for transformation, end quote. The IPCC continues, quote, the drivers of transformation are multidimensional, involving social, cultural, economic, environmental, technical, and political processes. The combination of this creates the potential for abrupt and systemic change, end quote. In the US, the foundation of our agriculture and the management of our built environment is intricately tied to polluting practices, with disproportionate harm affecting segments of our society and world who are exploited, low income, in ill health, and disproportionately people of color. We have a responsibility to find a different path, and we can. We don't have to be theoretical about this. We have organic systems in place, governed by a clear definition and requirements for compliance with standards under the Organic Foods Production Act in the US and with similar statutes worldwide. Those selling products as organic are required to adhere to a legal definition of soil management practices, a list of allowed and prohibited substances, a certification inspection system that establishes compliance with defined organic standards, and a participatory public decision-making process for continuous improvement. This approach, whether in agriculture or in our parks and playing fields, eliminates the reliance on fossil fuel-based toxic chemicals that release greenhouse gases. It also employs the ability of healthy soil, rich in biodiversity, to draw down atmospheric carbon. Our goal must be to adopt productive land management systems that do not use toxic petrochemical pesticides and fertilizers, substances that we can no longer use if we are to sustain life. The session will run until 2:30 Eastern, at which point we will take questions for our two speakers. Our first speaker today is Rachel Bezner, PhD, professor in the Department of Global Development in the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences at Cornell University. Dr. Bezner is steeped in both global problems and solutions to the climate crisis. She served as one of the three coordinating lead authors of the fifth chapter titled Food, Fiber, and Other Ecosystem Products of the IPCC report Climate Change 2022. Related to climate, the chapter confirms the slowing of agricultural productivity, an increase of deleterious effects on food supply chains, environmental complications underlying food systems, as well as emergent food insecurity and malnutrition around the world, a threat to the global goal of ending hunger. Additionally, the chapter examines forestry, aquaculture, crop and livestock systems, and ocean-based and inland fisheries, and improving global social justice. Dr. Bezner has carried out participatory research with farmers in Malawi and Tanzania on agroecology, nutrition, and climate change-related studies. She has said, quote, "The world can prevent severe impacts on people and on nature, but there is a brief and rapidly closing window to act." Dr. Bezner continues, quote, "When the most vulnerable and marginalized groups within the food system are involved in the planning and implementation of these solutions, they reduce climate risk and provide health and biodiversity benefits," end quote. Dr. Bezner is just back from COP27, the 27th conference of the parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, where she was a presenter. With that, I am so honored to welcome Dr. Bezner.
Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction, and I really appreciate being invited to this forum and look forward to the discussion. I am going to share my screen, and hopefully it works. That will be step number one. So can you see? Yes, then I want to make it now you can see my notes though.
Nope, we're good.
Excellent. Okay, so thank you very much. So I want to do three things in my presentation. I want to give an overview of the IPCC report that I worked on with many other authors, specifically around the impacts, vulnerability, and adaptation for food systems. And then I want to talk about agroecology as a transformative approach to food systems that addresses climate change adaptation, but also addresses other important aspects of food systems. And for that, I want to draw on broader research. And I had the opportunity to serve on the UN high-level panel of experts for the Committee for World Food Security. We produced a report on agroecology, so I'm going to draw on that. And then finally, I want to talk about my long-term collaborative research that I've conducted on agroecological approaches in Malawi and Tanzania, as examples of what we found thus far with that approach, and where there is some room for further research. And I look forward to discussions at the end. So Jay already outlined that our report really notes that there is robust scientific evidence. The IPCC, we don't do our own empirical research. We draw on the scientific research that is already published. And so we reviewed thousands of scientific studies and found that there is very strong evidence of climate change already having significant impact on food systems around the world, including affecting agricultural productivity. And that varies by region. But for example, in North America, between 1960 and 2013, one study estimated that it had affected agricultural productivity by 12.5%. And in addition to affecting agricultural productivity in the long term, there are also very significant evidence of extreme events caused by climate change having impact on the food system. And we also found significant evidence of impacts on ecosystem services such as pollination and soil health. And I wanted to hone in on that a little bit because this is a webinar series on being hosted by Beyond Pesticides. There's less research on the impacts of climate change having impact on pests and diseases, but what evidence there does indicate that there is increased risk of pest and disease outcomes, and that there may be multiple species interactions. So there is unknown to how great that risk is because of limited research. But there is evidence of increased invasive species and increased weed outbreaks, increased problem with weeds in the future, as well as the limited or the less effectiveness of herbicides and pesticides under increased climate change impacts. So alongside this challenge with increased weeds, potentially increased pests, shifting pests, and interactions between pests, there is also evidence of negative impacts on pollinators due to both the impacts from climate extremes, changes in the flowering, and so not always having food available, and reduced nutritional quality of pollen. So in terms of the overall impacts of climate change on food systems, there's increasing evidence of this link between these extreme events from climate change, so whether it's droughts or floods or heat waves or marine heat waves, and their impacts on all aspects of the food system. So all types of production, crop production, livestock production, aquaculture, and fisheries. And this is particularly relevant for it. It affects everyone if you're in a place where you have an extreme event, but some regions are much more vulnerable to these extreme events than others. And we found evidence of Africa, Asia, Central and South America, small island states, and the Arctic being particularly vulnerable to these climate extreme events, leading to reduced food production, reduced dietary diversity, and it can affect infrastructure and increase food prices. And all of these things can lead to an increase in acute food insecurity events and malnutrition. But in addition to these sort of vulnerability hotspots around the world, there are also particular groups who are more vulnerable to the experience of acute food insecurity because of climate change impacts. And these vulnerable and marginalized groups vary depending on what part of the world we're talking about, but they include women, children, indigenous peoples, smallholder producers, low-income households, and ethnic and other racial and ethnic minority groups. And so these groups are more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change on their livelihood, on increased risk of food insecurity, and the rising costs from the extreme events. In addition, the literature is increasingly finding the interaction of multiple impacts on the food system and non-climate related shocks interacting with climate extreme events. So for example, you may have a drought that may reduce local food production. It may lead to problems of lack of ability of people to work outdoors because of heat stress. You may have a risk of food contamination from toxins, and this may lead to an increase in food prices. And all of these can lead to dramatic impacts on acute food insecurity events. And the literature is more, there is more evidence now of this link, this direct link between climate extreme events and acute food insecurity events. So now, looking to the future, one of the core messages from our report is unless there is significant reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, we are going to see even more severe events and severity of impacts going forward. So water scarcity, issues of the likelihood of multiple breadbasket failure. So you have major food producing regions all having extreme events at the same time, leading to food insecurity problems around the world, and an increased risk of particular regions becoming unsuitable for crop and livestock raising because of heat and because of temperature and water stress. So in addition to the impacts and the vulnerability assessment, we also looked at the literature around adaptation options. And this is really where I want to focus the rest of my talk. And we found that while many people and organizations and governments are undertaking adaptation actions, it's mainly incremental, it's mainly focused on a single sector or a crop, or focused on a particular climate risk, and it's not the transformational adaptation that really needs to take place to address the climate change impacts that are anticipated. And we then reviewed the literature for what scientific evidence there is for different adaptation options within food systems. And we did what's called a feasibility and effectiveness assessment, which we drew from previous IPCC reports and methodology. And we looked at feasibility and effectiveness, not only in terms of is it reducing climate risk, but is it socially feasible, and does it address environmental dimensions, economic dimensions, political and institutional factors? So it was a holistic assessment of feasibility and effectiveness. And we found that there are many different options that could be undertaken, including cultivar improvements, agroforestry, farm and landscape diversification, community-based adaptation, and agroecological approaches. And many of these adaptation options have multiple benefits. They not only reduce climate risk, but they bolster biodiversity. They support ecosystem services. They address food security and nutrition needs and livelihoods. And many of these adaptation options, including agroecology, but in other options that we assessed, are what we fall under the category of ecosystem-based adaptation. So one of the emphases in our report is this strong link between paying attention to and caring for the underlying ecosystem and biodiversity that supports not only human health and well-being, but also, of course, other biota on this planet, but really taking approaches to adaptation that support biodiversity, support ecosystem services, and use natural ecological processes in adapting. And by doing so, we found that the scientific literature points to these having many other benefits beyond adapting to climate change, and that includes biodiversity, strengthening, supporting ecosystem services, providing livelihood opportunities, and so on. And in addition, the literature really emphasized that it's not only which option that you're undertaking, but how you're undertaking that adaptation strategy and who you're involving. And there was lots of robust evidence that it needs to be an inclusive approach that really involves the most marginalized in our societies from the beginning, in the planning, in the implementation, and making sure that we're paying attention to the power dynamics at work in adaptation if we want to have positive benefits for everyone. And technical approaches which ignore these power dynamics are really going to worsen climate impacts for these groups who vary by place. So as part of that inclusivity, there is also robust scientific literature around drawing on indigenous and local knowledge for adaptation strategies, and drawing on them using a wide roster of different educational approaches. So using the arts, using participatory modeling, using participatory scenario building, citizen science. So there's actually a rich literature around really innovative, creative strategies for drawing on Indigenous and local knowledge that really help to heighten awareness and involve people in making changes in real and substantive ways that also draw on their own knowledge bases. So one example is seasonal forecasting systems that are developed drawing on Indigenous knowledge from pastoralist systems and testing it out in dialogue with and in collaboration with pastoralist groups to make sure that that information is relevant and usable. And this has been found to be quite effective in helping them reduce their climate risk. In addition, there's a lot of evidence around, increasing evidence around maladaptation in food systems. So maladaptation are those adaptation actions that result in negative consequences. So it may increase greenhouse gas emissions, the adaptation action might worsen equity, or lead to ecosystem degradation. And often those groups that are already marginalized and disadvantaged are those most at risk from maladaptive options. One example in the literature on food systems is irrigation. So irrigation is often undertaken as an adaptation action, and it can increase food production and reduce climate risk, and certainly in the short term. But if it's not done carefully in the right place and carefully in terms of the process by which it's undertaken and with whom, then it can lead to worse outcomes. It can lead to soil salinization. It can lead to groundwater depletion. So the ecosystem that is supporting food production long-term can be negatively impacted. So longer term, you may have greater risk of food insecurity because of that. But it can also, if it's not done equitably and taking into account people's access to infrastructure and capital, it may lead to smallholder producers being pushed out of production because they can't afford this technology, and or it can increase their indebtedness and eventually lead to their livelihoods collapsing. And there is considerable evidence of this. But I want to emphasize that maladaptation is not just about a particular technological option, but is also about the process by which adaptation is undertaken. So as part of our assessment, we included looking at agricultural intensification particularly with the onset of the Ukrainian invasion. The conflict in Ukraine has gotten a lot of attention globally as necessary in order to sustain global food security. And so here I'm talking about increased use of fertilizer and pesticide and increased focus on productivity. But the literature really shows that this not only increases greenhouse gas emissions, and so one estimate from the use of fertilizer, for example, is synthetic fertilizer contributes a very significant amount of greenhouse gas emissions globally. I mean, the food system overall is estimated to contribute about 1/3 of all greenhouse gas emissions, but greenhouse gas emissions from fertilizer in 1 year was estimated to contribute about 1/5 of greenhouse gas emissions of the total that agriculture contributes. So it's a very significant component. But in addition, intensification can impact biodiversity and degrade ecosystem services such as soil erosion and salinization, and may displace local food producers and worsen their food security and livelihoods. And the literature is robust in having examples of where this has happened globally. So the overall impact can actually be negative in terms of food security and nutrition. So overall, the literature on adaptation really points to taking approaches that are integrated, so taking into account different parts, different systems. So not only thinking about food production, but thinking about health, thinking about energy, thinking about livelihoods, and taking inclusive approaches that really transform the systems away from fossil fuel-based reliance and toward approaches that have more ecosystem-based adaptation underpinning the food system. And and ones that take into account different types of risk for different groups of people. And so it's usually sort of a holistic package. And I give an example here of many different strategies that might be part of an overall integrated and inclusive approach to adaptation. So that was part one. I hope I didn't go too quickly. I now want to move to part two, which is talking about agroecology as a transformative approach to food systems. And it's really in contrast to the dominant approach to food production globally, which is sometimes called sustainable intensification, really focusing on productivity of a few main crops, often in monocultures, heavily reliant on fossil fuel inputs, and also very expert driven and not paying attention to political and social dimensions that cause hunger and food insecurity. In contrast, agroecology emphasizes diversification of species and maximizing sort of ecological processes to manage things like pests, recycling resources such as energy and water and organic material, and drawing on farmer knowledge and experimentation, as well as paying close attention to social and political dimensions of food systems. And as part of a member of the Committee for World Food Security high-level panel of experts, it's a mouthful and a bit of an obnoxious title, but I had this opportunity to work on a UN report on agroecology. And as part of that, we drew from the literature 13 principles that underpin that are agroecological principles, and these are depicted here. And at the bottom part of this diagram, you can see some of the principles that I was already mentioning, things like recycling, building synergies in the system, enhancing biodiversity, reducing reliance on toxic and fossil fuel-based inputs, strengthening soil health. But as you look at the upper part of this diagram, you'll see social and political dimensions that are really crucial in an agroecological system. And this includes co-creation of knowledge, fairness and equity in the system, addressing land and natural resource governance, so things like access to land, access to seeds, participation in the food system, so sort of democratizing the food system so that consumers and producers have a say in what kind of food is being produced and how, and building connectivity between producers and consumers. So these social and political dimensions are really also a core part of agroecology and what differentiates it from other sustainable food system production models, because it's really addressing questions of power and equity in the food system. And a core component of that is this participatory and equitable learning approaches. And this includes drawing on Indigenous knowledge, participatory action research, so farmer to farmer training, farmer networks, and close attention to social inequities at multiple scales. So whether it's gender inequity within households, whether it's inequity in terms of low-income households, whether it's inequity in the governance of the food system. So really close attention to these questions of equity. So the literature on agroecology does show evidence that it can provide an important mitigation role in climate change impacts. And this includes things like agroforestry as one agroecological practice where you have trees combined with crops or combined with silvopastoral systems, for example, with livestock, where you have carbon sequestration biomass in the trees themselves. And it also includes organic farming, which can significantly reduce nitrous oxide, although it can be noted that there's less empirical research on the contribution of organic farming from the global south. But in addition, agroecology, as I mentioned, the IPCC found this as well. Agroecology really supports resilience within food systems, building and climate change adaptation through multiple methods. One of the ways that it does so is through strengthening key ecosystem functions, such as building soil organic carbon, strengthening soil microbial activity, which during times of drought, for example, can mean that crops fare better than if they hadn't had this additional organic matter provided. And it can also build in resilience by having a greater biodiversity in the food system. So if one crop fails, you have more to rely on. It can provide important things such as shade for animals during heat waves. So there's a whole host of different ways that this that agroecological systems can enhance resilience. Now, a common question that's asked about agroecology is whether it can provide actually address food security and nutrition. And as part of that was really the main focus of the UN report that I worked on. And we did an assessment of the literature over the last 20 years. So this report was published in 2019. So we reviewed the literature from the last 20 years, looking for the evidence of whether agroecological approaches can lead to improvements in food security and nutrition. And we found that the vast majority of literature does provide evidence that it increases food security and nutrition. It has a positive relationship with food security and nutrition. And the more complex the agroecological system, the more likely it was to lead to improvements in food security and nutrition. So a very common study was just looking at crop diversity and food security or nutrition outcomes. And so that's just one practice. But if it was crop diversity combined with farmer cooperatives and intercropping and mulching, and did that increase food security and nutrition? So the more complex systems that incorporated social dynamics were more likely to lead to improvements in food security and nutrition. So those are my two overview sections. And I want to spend some time now talking about on-the-ground experience that I've had with colleagues in Malawi and Tanzania, looking at the evidence for trying out these agroecological approaches and whether they really can improve food security and nutrition, but also can they lead to other benefits? What are the impacts on livelihoods? What are the impacts on sustainable land management more generally? And I've been collaborating for over 20 years with a nonprofit farmer-led organization in Malawi called the Soils, Food and Healthy Communities Organization. And I've also led a sister project in Tanzania with ActionAid Tanzania and with numerous university collaborators in both contexts. And so I'm highlighting three different studies here, but and then I'll talk about a fourth one, but I've been involved in many different studies. In most of these studies, we've used a pre-post design. So doing a baseline study, looking at different indicators and then measuring after the intervention, but then also doing a control intervention. So comparing those farmers who are using agroecological practices with those who are not. And in most cases, we have selected specifically households who are highly food insecure to participate in to invite them to participate in the intervention. And we've done training on agroecological principles and then invited them to select what they wanted to test and provided seed for one growing season for 1/4 of an acre for them to test those practices. And then it's up to them to decide if they're going to sustain them longer term. But in addition to, and so this is a list of some of the different things that have been tested. So it's things like intercropping legumes together, making and applying compost, agroforestry systems, and crop diversification. But in addition, there's a big emphasis on farmer learning and farmer experimentation to adapt whatever strategy they're trying to their own particular agroecosystem and sociocultural context. In addition to the agroecological practices, these interventions have also included this close attention to social equity concerns and to nutrition. And this is part of a broader agroecological approach because it's paying attention to this social equity and cultural and social aspects of food systems. And so we have included community-based educational activities to address social inequities in communities, including gender inequity, but other social inequities, and to address different child nutritional dimensions. And we've developed a curriculum that uses a number of different educational strategies devised by the farming communities where we've done these interventions. And they include things like recipe days, theater, hands-on experiments, and small group discussions. So this combination of agroecological training and farmers testing out different practices combined with this community-based educational approach we've found significant improvements in food security and dietary diversity, both for specific practices such as crop diversity and compost application, but also for participation in the intervention itself, leading to significant improvements in food security and nutrition, controlling for other factors which affect food security and nutrition. So for example, in Tanzania, a child who was in a household that was participating in the agroecological intervention was 1.48 times more likely to have a minimum acceptable diet. And we also have found that gender relations really matter for agroecological impacts. So in one study, for example, we looked at whether husbands and wives were sharing information about farming together, and we found a very low proportion, only 10% were actually discussing farming. And part of the community-based educational activity really emphasized spouses talking to each other about the different strategies they were trying. And we found at the end that that number had increased to around 35%. And those who were now discussing farming with their spouse, and those farmers who were discussing farming with their spouse were 2.4 times more likely to be food secure and having diverse diets. We've also looked at the longer term. We've looked at, does it matter how many practices you incorporate? And we found that there's a significant link between the number of practices farmers are using and the likelihood of them transitioning from food insecurity to food security over time, and to increasing their income benefits from the agroecological practices. And we've looked at, does it matter if they're doing these farmer exchanges, farmer to farmer training, going to meet with other farmers once a month and sharing what they're learning? And we found that there is a significant link between those farmer to farmer strategies and the likelihood that they're going to practice these different agroecological practices. And we've also gone back after an intervention. So we had one 5-year intervention where we were working with 6,000 farming households. 2 years after it ended, we went back to 600 of those households, randomly sampled, and did a survey with them to find out what they were doing. And 90% of them were still using the agroecological practices. So this appears to be a strategy that sticks. Now, I have had the privilege in the last 4 years of leading a project funded by multiple public science organizations, including the NSF here in the United States, but also German, Norwegian, and Canadian institutions through a grant of Biodiversa and Belmont Forum, where it's called Farmer-Led Agroecological Research in Malawi for Biodiversity. We're looking in regions where we've been previously working, where there are many farmers using agroecological practices. And we're interested in knowing whether these agroecological practices at a landscape scale can support wild biodiversity and other ecosystem services, things like pollinators and pest control. And part of this project has really been involving farmer researchers in doing ecological data collection alongside ecologists. So we've been measuring butterfly presence, we've been measuring bee presence, we've been looking at the natural enemies and in fields. And we've been feeding that back into stakeholder groups to share sort of next steps based on our findings. And this project is in its final year. One of the things we found is a decline in pest damage as there's an increase in the number of farmers using agroecological practices, which this is preliminary, this is not published data, but we find this very encouraging and exciting. And we've also found a significant increase of agroecological methods on maize yield, which we think is partially related to the pest control, but also may be linked to improvements in soil health. One of our, we've published a paper that looks specifically at legume intercrops, which we've found to be a key ecological pest management tool, particularly in regions where there's low semi-natural forest for habitat for natural enemies. And the intercrops provide a source for natural enemies to live, it seems, to then eat pests. But these agroecological management strategies also support the soil microbiome and carabid diversity. And so this is promising findings. Farmers, as part of this project, have also been testing out different botanical sprays. So these are sprays made from readily available plants such as Tithonia and Vernonia that provide a natural pesticide role, but don't have the same harmful impacts as a synthetic pesticide because they may repel a pest rather than kill a pest. And there's been previous research done at a sort of more controlled level in Malawi and Tanzania, and we've taken that research and now been testing it at on farm level with farmers, where they make their own homemade botanical sprays and then test it on intercrops. And this is farmer experiments done with 36 different farming households, where they found that some of the sprays were effective at reducing pest damage for maize production. And it varies by crop and by botanical plant type. So this is current research. It's not yet published, so it's kind of underway. In addition, we have done participatory geospatial research as part of this project, really trying to understand if there's a linkage between farmers using agroecological practices and the reduction in deforestation. And this is related to biodiversity because semi-natural habitat plays a really key role in hosting natural enemies as well as pollinators who support food production. And we found that those regions that had agroecological practicing farmers had significantly more land under fallow and less land under cultivation. And they stated that they had that greater land under fallow because they were getting improved yields from strengthening their soil quality with organic matter being returned to the soil, and from having a greater diversity of crops on their land, they didn't feel they needed to extend it as much. So this is an exciting finding. And we also did a study looking at farmers' perceptions of ecosystem services and found that those farmers who were practicing agroecology tended to value protection of forests more than those who were using conventional agricultural methods. So just to conclude, I began by talking about some of the climate change impacts and adaptation strategies for food systems that we found in our assessment of the IPCC report, and noted that ecosystem-based adaptation approaches, including agroecology, there's a robust literature for that being a key strategy for not only supporting food production, but also supporting the ecosystems and biodiversity that we rely on. And there is robust literature that agroecology can improve food security and nutrition while supporting resilient food systems, including climate change mitigation, as well as adaptation. And that participatory methods are really a key component of of agroecological practices, as well as adaptation strategies more generally that are inclusive as a means to really transform the food system. And then I reviewed some of our research in Malawi as examples of participatory agroecological approaches that can improve food security and nutrition while bolstering ecosystems on which we rely on, but that there is lots of room for further research because there is very little research on agroecology more broadly. Some studies have found, for example, in the United States, that less than 2% of research is dedicated to agroecological strategies in terms of public science research. So with that, I just want to thank you and acknowledge my fellow authors of the IPCC, as well as my many collaborators in Malawi, Tanzania, and in Canada and the US, Norway, and Germany who have participated in these studies.
Wow, thank you so much. I mean, I think what you're describing really is heartening in that there is an international community behind this and the holistic thinking that we seem to somehow miss in the United States is going on around us. So I think we have a lot of work to do to bring ourselves up to speed, right? In terms of applying methodologies and integrating the social, political dimensions to this work. And we really appreciate the work you're doing. And so listen, I want to tell everybody that Dr. Bezner Kerr will be available for questions at the end. So you can start putting your your questions into the Q&A, and we will take those up and we'll have a chance to look at those. So thanks again for your presentation. Fabulous work, and we really appreciate the time you put into this event and all the work you're doing.
Thanks very much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you. So our next speaker is Andrew Smith, PhD, who is the Chief Operating Officer at the Rodale Institute in Pennsylvania, where he oversees research and farm operations at the Institute, and is passionate about growing the organic movement by providing science-based solutions to farmers and facilitating opportunities to expand the number of organic farmers and farmland across the globe. He has over 20 years of experience working in the organic field as an agronomist, researcher, and farmer. While trained as an entomologist, his motive for entering the organic field was to reduce the use of chemicals for food production that end up in our environment, our food, and our bodies. He is part of a team at Rodale working diligently on many projects to transform the food system and the way we farm to improve the lives and health of all people on the planet. He also continues to live and work on his own organic family farm. Dr. Smith is a contributor to the Rodale Institute's just released Farming Systems Trial 40-year report, which captures the solution-oriented results of the longest running longitudinal study comparing chemical-intensive ag productivity with organic. The report concludes, not to steal your thunder, Dr. Smith, but an economic analysis shows that organic systems are more profitable for farmers than conventional agriculture is, and we're going to be really eager to hear about that. Dr. Smith is also, importantly, co-author of the 2020 white paper, Regenerative Organic Agriculture and the Soil Carbon Solution, which outlines a strategy based on the Institute's research for combating the climate crisis. The report analyzes data available on soil carbon sequestration potential in the past decade to conclude that a global switch to regenerative crop and pasture systems could draw down more than 100% of the annual CO2 emissions. As the report states, we now know enough to have real hope, and with this hope comes the responsibility to journey down a new path. So with that, I'm honored to welcome you, Dr. Andrew Smith.
Great, thank you so much, Jay, and it's a pleasure to be here with you and everyone. Can you see my screen? Is that?
We can. Yep. It has the notes on the side, but we can see everything.
Yeah, let me just, is that in presenter mode or do you see it?
Now it's in presenter. Well, no. No, it's still in a separate mode.
How about now?
Now it's in presenter mode. That's good.
You can see that clear. Great. Well, thank you, everybody, bearing with me here. And thank you, Jay. And thank you for, it's really an honor to be invited by Beyond Pesticides to present and talk a little bit about the work that we're doing that Jay already set up pretty well. I'm going to talk a little bit real briefly about the history of Rodale. It's going to be heavily, research-based, science-based presentation where we're talking very specifically about one area of a nature-based solution for climate mitigation, and that's soil carbon sequestration. Rodale Institute is deeply embedded in the organic movement. The founder, J.I. Rodale, he started Organic Gardening and Farming magazine. We think it was 1942 was the first letter that he wrote. And that publication, which was widely popular, especially among organic farmers in the second half of the 20th century, is where we get that term organic to mean what we have now as a USDA program, but at the time was largely, chemical-free or natural forms of food production. His son Bob really, took research and the organic movement to another level. He was a strong advocate for the USDA National Organic Program, traveling down to Washington, D.C. almost on a weekly basis to try to promote and get movement to create a national organic program. And he started using the word regenerative to mean a form of agriculture that really goes beyond organic. It's a form of continuous improvement. And he put down some of those principles, and we're starting to see this term regenerative being used now. And we're concerned that the word regenerative could somewhat be diluted. And that gets me to our other key person on our staff, Jeff Moyer, who's our current CEO. He was a founding board member and chairman of the National Organic Standards Board, and more recently worked with other organizations to create what's now called the Regenerative Organic Alliance and a new set of standards called the Regenerative Organic Certification, which in addition to a environmental or land-based standards also includes animal welfare and social fairness aspects. But so we come at this very much from the organic perspective. But what we recognize is that if someone goes through the certification process, there's now a certified organic farm. That doesn't automatically lead to or make them more environmentally friendly, or all the other aspects of sustainability that I'm showing here on this screen. But what we find is, especially in our research as we help farmers, is as you begin to put into practice the methods that are going to make you a successful farmer, they often lead to other outcomes. And I'm showing this here briefly just to show some of those benefits or those outcomes as a result of a switch from a conventional, chemical intensive form of agriculture to a more biologically based form of organic agriculture. And here in this ecosystem services realm is where we would find soil carbon sequestration. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about soil carbon sequestration, some of the data that we have about that, both from other sources as well as Rodale Institute, and also look at point us in the direction of some other areas of research that we need to go. But one thing we recognized long before we were even having this conversation about climate change and global warming was that farmers that were practicing organic methods had more carbon in their soil. And we largely has been shown that increased organic matter in your soil improves the function of your soil, and in many different ways. It holds on and retains nutrients. It holds on to and retains moisture and water. It reduces erosion because we have greater infiltration. And for many of those reasons, we see similar to some of the slides that were just shown, that as we increase the soil, the health of the soil and increase the carbon in the soil, it usually leads to increased crop yields. So we started looking into this. In 2014, we wrote our first white paper. And then recently, as Jay said, in 2020, we released this more recent white paper. And it's not a scientific paper. It's a review of the literature, where we review the literature and where are the gaps in knowledge and understanding. But why we think this topic is so important as well, I'm going to say a short-term climate mitigation strategy is because the greatest reservoir of carbon in the world is held in soil. So there's more than all the terrestrial vegetation and the atmospheric carbon combined is held in the soil. We also know that our land-based practices and mostly our agricultural practices over the last several hundred years and has been largely exacerbated due to increased populations and intensification of agriculture has led to loss of carbon in the soil. So we're asking the question, well, what if we put that carbon back into the soil? Not only will we be mitigating climate change, but we will be potentially increasing food security and the function of the soil. So we review the literature. What I have here is the total greenhouse gas emissions on an annual basis. I'm sure this is might change, but at the time of publication, this was our global greenhouse gas emissions. So 55.3 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent. So that's all greenhouse gas emissions. And then 37.5 gigatons is carbon dioxide alone. So we were looking at this and we were asking the question, well, what if we had a complete switch over to these more regenerative and organic practices? Could we completely offset greenhouse gas emissions? And one thing that's really important to say here is that first of all, we would like to see that switch happen now, more in the more immediate future. But in the United States, we're still at 1% of all farmland as certified organic. So it's not happening as fast as we'd like to see. The other thing is it's a short-term solution because soil only has the capacity to only hold so much carbon. So while we can draw down carbon in the short term, hold that in the soil, and we hope that it will hold in forms of soil that can be longer term, if we continue to, our continued practices in other areas and continue to increase greenhouse gas emissions, then we won't reach the goals that we need to. So I just want to preface that we think this is a potential strategy, an important strategy, but really something that should be implemented over the next 10 to 30 years while we create other technological solutions to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. This table shows some of the exemplary studies, and what I'll be showing you some of these studies, but as we go from the top to the bottom, what we find is things like cover crops, the use of plant-based green manures that are grown not to be a cash crop, but be grown for some reason, maybe to add fertility, to reduce erosion. This is a standard practice on most organic farms. There's a lot of research on this. You're going to see that there's a good amount of research on long-term systems trials, and these two here in the U.S. Mid-Atlantic are studies that came out of here at Rodeo. One that I'm going to talk about now, which is still going, and another one that was very much focused on replacing synthetic salt-based fertilizers with organic compost. But a lot of these as we look at other potential systems in carbon sequestration, we often only find a handful of studies. So sometimes only 1 or 2 studies on these different systems. So systems in tropics look like they have high potential for soil carbon sequestration, but there's only been a few studies that have measured that. Mediterranean system, same thing. And then in grazing systems and livestock, we actually think the use and the smart regenerative management of livestock can be a carbon mitigation strategy, where often livestock are demonized as one of the greatest sources of greenhouse gas emissions. So let me review just briefly review some of the strategies that are standard. So I mentioned cover crops, crop rotation, organic fertility methods. So this is compost, manures, and natural fertilizers. Compost and manures make a lot of sense because they contain carbon in them. We're putting carbon onto the soil. But natural fertilizers, they're slow release, and we're going to talk a little bit about nitrous oxide and synthetic fertilizers and greenhouse gas emissions. And these natural fertilizers don't have the same impact of reducing carbon in the soil because they're slow release, and they don't result in greenhouse gas emissions. In addition of perennial systems, not just what you might think of like an orchard system, but also hay and pasture, and maybe a combination of hay with more annual cropping systems, livestock integration, and then reduced tillage. And I'm going to talk a little bit more in depth about tillage, because a lot of what we're seeing as strategies for climate change is we'll just reduce tillage or no till, and add cover crops. And so I'm going to tackle those in a little bit more in depth. And you're going to see that we don't think it's a strategy because a continuous no-till or complete elimination of tillage means in a massive amount of herbicides that are being applied to our environment that have side effects other than just a carbon mitigation strategy. And then I'm going to show you some I'm going to basically show you, or hopefully convince you, that we need much more diversified practices than just cover crops and reduced tillage to improve soil carbon sequestration. And so the majority of land in the United States looks like this right now. As this is what I see out my window, is corn that's either about to be harvested or harvested, has no cover crop on it. And that's about 70% of US agriculture is corn, monoculture, corn and beans, maybe continuous cotton or rice. And an improvement on that is to add a cover crop. And probably the most common is that cereal rye or some small grain following the cash crop, and letting that grow before the next season, before planting the next year. One thing to point out is it has a very high carbon to nitrogen ratio. So there's a high level of carbon here. There's a lot of benefits to this, to water quality. This is scavenging nitrogen and keeping it from leaching. But it's really very simplistic. We would like to see more of a diverse cover crop that has maybe clovers and vetch and peas, things that are nitrogen fixing, leguminous plants, and they have a much lower carbon to nitrogen ratio. And our new theory or hypothesis that's developing around soil carbon sequestration is that if we give a higher quality amount of carbon, which means more nitrogen within these carbon sources, that microbes can take greater advantage of that as a food source. And it's the microbes that are ultimately leading to longer term forms of carbon storage in the soil. So I want to give you one example I think this is a pretty phenomenal study. So this is the Century experiment at UC Davis. It was established in 1993. And it's looking at several Mediterranean cropping systems. One of those is a corn tomato rotation. The other one is a wheat fallow rotation. I'm going to just focus in here on the corn tomato rotation. And this study was that I'm going to show you is after 19 years of management practices. So they have the three systems. One of those is the conventional system, utilizing synthetic fertilizers and no cover crop in that system. The other system is conventional, again using synthetic fertilizers and pesticides, but it adds a cover crop, and it actually adds a more diverse mix of cover crops. It's not just a single cereal, but it has, I think, 3 different species in that cover crop mix. And then they have an organic system, which is no synthetic fertilizers, no synthetic pesticides, the use of cover crops, and then the addition of poultry manure as a source of fertility. And I think this is pretty profound study to show, because the majority of our knowledge and what you often see presented is often looking at organic matter or carbon in the 0 to 15, or maybe down sometimes only to the 20 centimeter level. And if we look here, maybe in the top 30 centimeters, we're seeing that it looks like adding that cover crop to the system is really a benefit. If we just look down to 30 centimeters, and the cover crop plus the poultry manure is even higher, which we might expect to see. But as we start to go down in the soil profile, so if I didn't mention it, but they're taking 2 meter deep or 200 centimeter deep cores prior to starting the study, and then 19 years later in all of the different systems. As we start to go down deeper, we actually start to see that the system with the cover crop is actually losing carbon. And then if we look at the whole profile, we find that statistically there was no change in carbon in that 2 meter depth when we had no cover crops. But we actually lost, there's a statistically significant decrease in total carbon stocks where we had just the use of a cover crop, but a significant increase if we were adding both cover crops and the poultry. And so again, what I'm trying to express here is that we need more than just a single solution. The system has to be more diversified. And I think you're going to see a theme that when we use composts and manures and organic fertility methods, that we have improved soil carbon. This is a study that we were part of. You can see here the arrow, which is where Rodale Institute is located. But the Soil Health Institute identified 125 long-term research trials. They had to be in existence for over 10 years across the country. As Jay mentioned, our trial, which I'm going to show a lot of data from here in a couple minutes, is the longest in North America. It's in its 43rd year this year. And they took over 100 different soil health indicators for each, not just each trial, but each different treatment, replicated plots at each one of these different trials and locations. And there's a lot of publications that are coming out. I'm going to focus on this one, which was looking more at the soil carbon aspects. And I'll run down, maybe I'll look at the top 2 first: rotation, diversity, and crop count. As we look at this, it suggests that there's really no improvement in soil carbon as a result of crop rotation diversity. But what I will say is a couple things. One is this is skewed a little bit in that the majority of these systems, the standard practice is corn monoculture, and corn provides a tremendous amount of carbon biomass for one. So I think that's one reason why this is being skewed. The other thing is that most of the rotations that are being studied are not that diverse. They're 2 or 3 year crop rotations. But I just want to point out the importance of crop rotation in disrupting pest cycles, disrupting weed cycles. It's critically important. And as we look down and we start to look at organic nutrients and cover crops, a lot of times this crop rotation allows windows to be able to include cover crops and to include times when you're going to spread organic nutrients on the field. So it's still very important. But real quick, the different types of carbon that are represented here is soil organic carbon, probably the most commonly studied or you find in the literature. POXY is permanganate oxidizable carbon or active carbon. It's carbon that is highly utilizable by microbes in the soil. Water extractable organic carbon. The C-min24 and C-min96 are their respiration rates. So the amount of carbon dioxide emitted in 24 hours or 96 hours. And then BG is beta glucosidase. So that's a level or an indication of it's an enzyme, but it's an indication of the organisms that are able to break down carbon in the soil and use it as a food source. But what I think the takeaway here is what they really found is that the use of organic nutrients and cover crops in most cases are the most important, and residue retention are the most important for increasing soil carbon. And tillage in some cases was significantly or was important, but doesn't appear to be as important as those two practices or methods. And if we look at this, we actually find that in some cases, so what this is showing is that each square is a different trial. And if it's green, that means it was a positive response to this management practice, meaning that it was an increase. For example, the first column is soil organic carbon. So this tillage either increase or decrease soil organic carbon. And the yellow or I don't know if there's a yellow or brown or orange, but those other squares show that there's a negative or loss of carbon. And you can see that in many cases, reduced tillage actually results in a loss of carbon in the soil. And that's mostly because a lot of that carbon or that plant-based material sits on the soil and its ultimate fate is carbon dioxide. But when we till, we actually work it into the soil and it becomes a source of food for bacteria and fungi, which can turn it into a form of carbon that can be held longer in the soil. So let me describe now the farming systems trial, which was established in 1981, and present a set of slides on some of our soil carbon measurements that we've taken. The organic manure system really represents what might be a dairy or beef operation. It's more diversified. We're utilizing composted manure and turning that back into the field as a source of fertility, with addition of leguminous cover crops. And it's a longer crop rotation. So in addition to grain crops, we also have forage crops that include alfalfa and orchard grass, which results in an 8-year crop rotation. The organic legume system is a low input system that has never used any source of fertility in the 42 years other than plant-based leguminous cover crops. We actually look at this, you're going to see that it's the least productive, and maybe we have the potential using additional sources of fertility to improve the production in this system. And then the conventional system follows what's the standard practice of the day. So we get all of our recommendations from Penn State University. We have a relationship with some of the scientists there, and they recommend to us what they're recommending to all the farmers across the state. So we're not making the decisions necessarily on what herbicides to spray and what fertilizers to use, but we're getting them from our extension office and from the university, and we're practicing what would be the standard in our area. In 2008, we added no-till, and I'm going to show you a little bit or talk to you a little bit about what that means in the organic systems. In the conventional system, it's continuous no-till. So since 2008, these plots that are in the conventional no-till system have not been plowed at all. And it's it's based on herbicides. And I think I actually have a little, well, the next slide, I'm going to show you some of the results from our 40-year report. But the next slide here, I have a little more information about our tillage treatments. So our conventional, like I said, it's continuous no-till, mostly using glyphosate. We've had an increase in resistant weeds over time. So in addition to glyphosate, we've added atrazine, 2,4-D, metallochlor, and some other herbicides in order to mitigate weed resistance. Our standard in both the organic and conventional is a full tillage system where we're plowing, we're disking, we're packing prior to planting. And then the cover crop based no-till system is one that we've been developing here at the Rodale Institute since 2003. There's been several groups that have worked on this, some in Georgia, some in Brazil. But this is a large part of our current research, because even though we have found that we can produce yields that are equivalent to conventional systems, in many cases it requires heavy amounts of tillage. So we till the soil to control weeds. We cultivate to manage the weeds. And usually that cultivation is several cultivations in a year. Our standard practice is probably 8 or 9 passes or trips across a field in order to maximize production. And since we have such a heavy focus on soil, we recognize that tillage can have a negative impact on soil and also a negative impact on environmental consequences when we have soil exposed to the elements such as rain. So let me briefly describe our organic cover crop based no-till. We are still tilling the soil to establish cover crops in the fall, and we're still tilling the soil to establish small grains such as oats and wheat. But we establish the soil. This is very much what our fields look like right now in the number 1 slide. But that rye will undergo rapid growth in the in the spring when it warms up, creating tremendous amount of biomass on the soil that we use what we're calling a roller crimper to manage that cover crop biomass and then plant directly behind it, all in one pass. And if all goes well, you see the picture there, which I think this is from 2020, where we had a very good year for soybeans and corn. Then we have that as a weed suppressing mulch. It also helps keep moisture into the soil. So there's a lot of benefits. There are times when weeds get out of control, and so we're working on different strategies. It's a active area of research for Rodale Institute. And here's an example of a side-by-side research plot where we have tilled and organic no-till. And so in the farming systems trial, since we started, we were taking soil measurements at 0 to 20 centimeters. And more recently, we have been taking samples down to 1 meter. Most of our data is showing that we find very little difference between management practices below 60 centimeters. But I'll show you some data that I'll show you that data in a little bit. But the 2 takeaways is one, that we noticed that we increased organic matter very quickly when we transitioned from a conventional system. So this field, where in 1981, where this started, was under intensive tillage and intensive chemical use. And in just a few years, I think about 5 years, we saw a significant increase in soil organic matter. And the other thing that we're finding is that we find soil organic carbon deeper in the soil in the organic systems. So let me walk you through a couple of slides here on this one. This was a paper that was published by Laura Drinkwater in Nature in 1985, after 15 years of management in the manure, legume, and conventional system. And the white bar here is carbon levels in 1981, and then the gray bar is carbon levels in 1995. In both your manure and legume system, there were significant increases in soil carbon, but not in the conventional system. And if we look at this on an annual basis, it represents 3.12 milligrams of carbon per hectare per year offsets, or it would be, if we were to extrapolate this and put these practices on a global basis, we'd be talking about an 8% of total global greenhouse gas emission offsets. And you're going to actually, as I look at some other studies, you're going to see that this is actually not that high. We think we can do a lot better than this. But I also want to take a quick look at nitrogen, since we were talking about nitrous oxide. So this first panel here is the nitrogen inputs. So synthetic fertilizer, grass-based leguminous plants, and leguminous plants plus compost in the, the manure system is the compost plus plant-based, and then the right panel is the conventional, so synthetic fertilizers. The B panel are exports, the amount of nitrogen that's taken away from the harvest of the crop. And then this is the surplus nitrogen. So this is basically A minus B. So how much nitrogen in the system was not removed by the crop. But if you look at the manure system, this is now the amount of nitrogen that's retained in the soil. In the manure system, there's a significant increase in the amount of nitrogen that's retained in the soil. In the conventional system, there's a significant decrease in the amount of nitrogen that's retained in the soil over that 15-year period. And what that means is, in order to maintain the conventional system, because it's depleted its nitrogen reservoir, it's required to add more nitrogen fertilizer on a yearly basis. Where in the manure system, and to some extent in the legume system, we really need very little increased inputs in order to achieve adequate production or yields. And this is important because where did that nitrogen go? It largely went either in the ground as nitrate, or it went up into the environment as nitrous oxide. And you can see the N2O, or nitrous oxide, is one of along with the production of the fertilizer, you can see here in blue, are the two biggest portions of greenhouse gas emissions from a conventional system. And this is a study that was published in 2005, and also we reported in our 30-year report of the farming systems trial. But this is just to highlight that we've done an analysis, and we've seen that in the farming systems trial, the organic system has lower greenhouse gas emissions. And largely what tips the scale is nitrous oxide emissions from the soil and mineral fertilizer production. In some reviewing of the literature recently, and really just the last couple of years, it looks like the organic, there's such little research on nitrous oxide emissions and greenhouse gas emissions from organic systems, that there's a high probability that this is actually an overinflated value. And as we do more work on climate mitigation and understanding agricultural systems, I think we're going to find that the use of compost and manures actually has less greenhouse gas emissions than are currently being credited. And more recently, we've also been looking at nitrates both in the soil and in water samples. And as we can see here, the conventional systems in blue, as we look at our 30 and 45 centimeter depths, we see higher levels of nitrogen in a form that is water soluble and high potential for leaching. And this is important because this graph is showing the nitrogen balance, but it's really a nitrogen imbalance that we see across the United States. In these areas where we have heavy agricultural intensification, we're really over applying nitrogen to an extent that we really don't need for adequate crop production. And it's largely in a soluble synthetic form that's being either leached into things like the Mississippi River and then into the Gulf of Mexico, maybe the Chesapeake Bay, which is a little more home for us in Pennsylvania, or it's being evaporated as nitrous oxide. But there's methods that we've shown now that we can use to replace these fertilizers. This is a recent study we did where we looked at differences in the systems at 1 meter depth. This is only showing 0 to 30 centimeters because below 30 centimeters, we didn't find any significant differences between systems. And these are some of the same ones that we showed before: soil organic carbon, the POC, water extractable carbon, and then microbial biomass carbon. That's the amount of carbon that's in the microbes that are in the bodies of the microbes in the soil. And for the most part, what we see here is that as we go deeper, we start to really see that the organic manure system has higher amounts or higher levels of carbon in the soil. And in many cases, the conventional system is depleted, or is beginning to be depleted in carbon deeper in the soil. And that's the deeper that we can put the carbon in the soil, the less respiration, the less microbial activity exists, and so it's less likely to be converted back into carbon dioxide or greenhouse gas. I saw a question about let me go back in the chat about continuous till versus no till. So we've had a series of publications. If you were to look in the literature, most of them have Pearson's as the first author, where we've compared. We now have 12 years to be able to compare continuous conventional no-till to both the organic system and what we call a reduced till system, since it's not complete continuous no-till. And I would say that I'm showing you two soil health measurements. One is that microbial biomass carbon, and the other soil compaction. But for the vast majority of these measurements that we took, there was no statistical difference between tillage. So in these, except for the soil compaction, but in this one, if we look at microbial biomass carbon, there's no difference between systems, between the tillage systems within the system, and the more diversified manure system almost always has improved soil health or improved soil organic carbon. If we look at soil compaction, the continuous no-till actually had the worst outcome. This is reversed because what we're measuring here is the depth in centimeters till we hit 300 psi, and 300 psi is the pressure that roots either cannot penetrate or are very limited in penetrating. So this is basically the root zone. You can see that the root zones of the organic systems are deeper, so they can scavenge for nutrients. But this also has a major impact on water infiltration. So we see a very similar outcome in water infiltration. And I removed some of the slides on water quality, but what we're finding is that when we talk about climate resilience, this is important, because I'm going to show you some yield data in a minute. And what we're finding is that during reduced rainfall years or drought years, the organic manure system always outproduces the conventional system. And we attribute
Dr.
that.
Smith, sorry, just real quick, a few minute warning, please.
Okay, sure. Let me move on then. So I want to show you a little bit of economic data, because some might ask, well, that's great that we can achieve greater soil carbon sequestration with an organic system, but if we can't make a living or we can't feed people with it, then it's not a system we can adopt. So I'll run through these slides quickly, but you can see here that the costs of the conventional system are higher than the organic systems. And these are largely due to the inputs in pesticides and fertilizer, and a little bit higher in the full till systems, usually because we have more labor. We've consistently seen this, but yields, corn and wheat, where we have direct comparisons, are comparable between the more diversified manure system and the conventional system. Soybean yields are a little lower, and that's largely because of weed management. And so that's an active area of research for us. And when we include organic premiums, both the organic systems are more profitable. When this is gross revenues. When we eliminate the price premium, so this is the price that is standard for conventional, we actually see the revenues are comparable between the organic manure and the conventional. But as we saw before, the conventional system the costs were higher. And so if this is the total net revenues, when we completely eliminate organic premiums, the more diversified organic manure system is the most profitable system for farmers. It also produces the greater amounts of protein and nutrition, since we have a more diversified system. And here I'll just run through some of what I think is low-hanging fruit, but also areas that we really need more research to demonstrate. One of those is converting food waste and other resources to organic fertility. We know that we waste 40% of our crops. And when we look around, there's a lot of material going to landfill, things like leaves that could be utilized as organic sources of fertility. There's been very few studies, as I mentioned before, on perennial systems. And here's a couple examples that were in our white paper, where we have an olive groves that use both cover crop and compost. Again, the addition of compost really increasing soil organic carbon or soil carbon compared to just cover crops in both olive groves and other Mediterranean systems. The white paper that we just released a couple years ago had a high emphasis on this holistic adaptive grazing, and that's largely because previously there wasn't a lot of data. So we're now starting to get more data on the carbon sequestration potential of rangeland and grazing management. And this is important because over 70% of the land base in the world is not suitable to grow crops, but is suitable for rangeland or pasture management. So we think this is important strategy. This is a picture from Rodale Institute where we had a project integrating livestock in the cropping system. So these cattle are grazing on wheat and rye, and we really think that the integration of livestock with cropping systems, it not only does it improve soil organic carbon, but it reduces the need to transport sources of manure and compost using vehicles, and again increasing greenhouse gas emissions. And this is my last slide, but integrating livestock with perennial crops and putting all these systems together, stacked enterprises, we think have tremendous potential for soil carbon sequestration, but there's very little, if no, data to support these systems or to make that claim. So again, thank you. And that's the end of my presentation.
Wow, thank you, Drew. Really appreciate your efforts here and your work. I mean, there's a tremendous amount of data, obviously, that is important that we all digest and apply more broadly. I think the efforts of the Rodale Institute have been revolutionary, especially in the early years when even talking about organic was seen as heresy. And having testified before Congress with Bob Rodale, he stood up to that challenge in the ag committees of Congress pretty well. So it took it, and it will take the persistence, I think, of all of us to sort of address these challenges and get over some of these hurdles, which brings us to the questions. But before getting to the questions, I wanted y'all to know about our board president and give her an opportunity to speak. This is Paula Dinnerstein, who is the president of the Beyond Pesticides Board of Directors. She is the general counsel to PEER, which is Public Employees for Environmental Responsibility, where she represents whistleblowers. Before joining PEER, Paula has a long, illustrious history of representing Beyond Pesticides on a number of what we thought at the time were pivotal cases that would rattle the institutions that were fomenting pesticide dependency on some of the chemicals that Rachel Carson warned us about, like chlordane and the DDT family of organochlorines, and then some of the wood preservatives that are, we used to call legacy chemicals, and now we're dealing with new legacy chemicals around PFAS. So with that, Paul, I wanted to just let everybody know that we have great leadership in this organization, and turn it over to you for a minute.
And so, hello, everybody, and thank you for coming. I've been a long time board member of Beyond Pesticides and recently became the chair, and as Jay mentioned, worked on some of the early pesticide cases. I'm really happy to hear these presentations and that people are out there doing this kind of research about what works, to confront these, what often seem like really overwhelming global problems. As the last presentation showed, sometimes the results are somewhat surprising and are not what we would expect, but we are so grateful that people are there finding the real answers and what can solve these global problems in terms of, the problems with pesticides and other things that are causing climate change. And as in the previous webinars that we had, health problems and biodiversity problems are all intertwined and all subject to these solutions that these presenters have been researching. So I'm just really proud that Beyond Pesticides has been able to have these people present their amazing work, and looking forward to the Q&A for people to discuss them.
Thanks, Paula. Yeah, so let's jump right into this. I know we have limited time now, and thank you, Dr. Bezner Kerr, for jumping in there and answering a lot of these questions already. One of the questions that you already did answer, I think deserves, discussion, because I think one of the important aspects of the IPCC work and your work in particular is, and the UN generally on climate, is defining the problems in the starkest of terms, which you would think would rattle people enough to consider what one questioner said, something that might disrupt the vertically integrated industrial supply chain or something like that. Given the interaction that you have had with the international community, a lot of countries are much further along than we are in the US in terms of having these conversations at high levels. I mean, we do throw money at organic in paltry ways, really. What more can we do to elevate the urgency so that the solutions that you are researching and you put into practice, as has Rodale, become more palatable, whether they're challenging or not, that we must make these dramatic changes if literally we are to survive, if you read the UN reports closely.
I think that's a tough question, and I do think that there is changes in sort of openness to alternatives to the dominant food system, because there is more recognition of some of the problems that it's currently posing. So I think constantly questioning the narrative that our current food system is feeding the world, and critically drawing attention to what what problems it is posing, I think is important. And providing the evidence for that. So yeah, I'm really excited, and providing evidence for an alternative, because I think part of it is this fear that if we start talking about transforming to an organic agroecological system, people are going to starve, and the world is going to collapse. So I think part of it is trying to get it more into the public sphere, sort of awareness of alternatives and the evidence for those alternatives, and critically examining what the current food system is doing in multiple arenas. It's not feeding the world in the sense that there are still many people who are food insecure, and it's also making many people sick because of the kind of food that it produces is not making us healthy. So I would say there's, and I guess speaking to people's interests, some people are really concerned about health issues. Some people are concerned about biodiversity and environmental issues. Some people are worried about the cost of food, so I think finding ways to talk to those different interests is important.
Yeah, I'm curious in the approach, this goes to both the US and in countries around the world. When you walk into a community, what level of awareness do you see? I mean, I had the opportunity to visit with peasant farmers in Haiti at a time after the earthquake, when Monsanto was down there offering genetically engineered seed. And there was enough awareness there that the offer, the magnanimous corporate agriculturists coming into subsistence agriculture was not a positive development. That awareness was there in the community. Are you seeing that type of awareness in communities that you go into?
I think that in my experience working in Malawi, farmers may have very little awareness of the broader global context, but they may have some skepticism about what's being put on offer. There was a similar experience in Malawi in 2002, and I was there at the time. There was a very severe food shortage due to a confluence of drought, conflict in Mozambique, and political problems, both international and global and national. Governments were, the international community and the national government were partially responsible, and the same company offered free seed, not seed though, free grain, but they didn't want to mill it. They wanted to donate it as unmilled corn, which meant that it would be used as seed. And farmers were suspicious about this. There was suspicion and concern. What does this mean? Why are they giving us this in this form? So sometimes there is some farmer organizations, there is sort of increased awareness, but not no. That's a long answer to your question.
And Dr. Smith, so much of what you talk about, both you and Dr. Bezner Kerr, in terms of ecosystem services, I think is the language now more in the farming community, right? You couldn't really have that conversation. Well, you could on a superficial level, but I think, or is this something you're seeing a greater openness to, that there is value that can be partnered with in nature, that nature offers us something that we need to consider using? And I don't want to use the word exploiting, because that's not what we want to do, right? We want to regenerate. So, but we want to partner and we want to enhance. under the organic regulations, we use the word enhance biodiversity through agricultural systems. Do you see that growing, that conversation in your discussion with Penn State guys?
Well, yeah, I'd say, I think we're at a tipping point, and especially if we're talking about, larger scale production in developed countries like the United States. I think Europe's already ahead of us. But what I see, and like I said, or you mentioned, I've been working in organic agriculture for 20, 25 more years. And you go to a conference, and like you said, Jay, organic was demonized the whole time, and if you ask a university professor what they thought, they'd tell you, well, that's stupid. Why would you want to be organic? And most of the large companies they saw organic as a threat because it might increase their inputs. It might increase the feed that they need to feed to produce their finished product. And farmers, for that reason, didn't really embrace organic, but they really see that something's wrong. I mean, they really know that something's wrong. They see in these rural communities that the economics, the money is going to these large national companies and not staying in the community. They can see that people aren't healthy in their own families. And they see that the price of inputs just completely fluctuate with the price of crops and have nothing to do with the actual production costs. And this is even before the more recent spike. And if you looked at that slide that I had on costs, in many cases, the cost of GMO seeds is higher than organic seeds. And a lot of them are treated with pesticides. And so there's a lot of things that are going into that are spiking the input costs. And farmers I think they're fed up with it, and they're realizing that they've probably been lied to. And at the same time, a lot of these larger companies now sell organic, and they're coming to Rodale Institute and saying, hey, we need more organic farmers because we buy organic corn and we want to buy organic wheat. And they now see an incentive to getting more farmers certified organic, where in the past they were doing what they could to keep farmers from considering organic. So, the USDA census just came out this week, or at least I got mine in the mail. And I'm really interested to see, probably about this time next year, what the growth in the organic industry or the acreage is, especially in the United States. And I might also say that, from looking at research in developing countries, certainly Dr. Bezner Kerr has a lot more experience than I do, but we actually think that these methods can be applied more economically, especially in the communities where they can't afford to purchase all those inputs. But things, recycling nutrients and making compost, crop rotations, using cover crops, intercropping, these are all really more about your mindset and knowledge than they are about buying something.
Yeah. I'm curious, given all your work and your high titles with the UN, which I appreciated your reference to that. Do you feel that's a mechanism to advance change? There historically is a lot of skepticism about what the UN can do, just as there's skepticism about what USDA can and will do around organic. I mean, all these institutions bring with them baggage of, attempts that have failed perhaps, or not reach goals that were set. But when you look around at the different vehicles for facilitating and advancing change, the UN is at the top of the list in terms of putting out the data and, at least giving voice to the research in these publications in a way that you don't really see anywhere else. At the same time, do you, as a participant in that process, see that institution, or do you see any other institution as advancing the change at the speed at which we need to advance change here?
No institution is advancing at the speed that we need to advance. having worked for 3.5 years on this IPCC report, we cannot move fast enough to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions and to prepare our systems for the climate change impacts that are already being experienced. But we need to really increase pressure on governments and citizens and companies, all institutions, to take action on reducing greenhouse gas emissions because of the impacts that are already being observed, and will only get worse. The UN, I think, can play a useful role, certainly since serving on the high-level panel of experts. That report that we produced, I think, gave legitimacy to agroecology in a way that hadn't previously perhaps been recognized in terms of scientific literature. And I know that some governments were quite interested in learning from that. So I know that there was increased funding opportunity for research in the European Union, for example. The United States is quite a different political context. So I'm not sure that the UN is really the right institution to try to influence the political context of the US. I think it's a harder nut to crack in a way. Yeah. So maybe Dr. Smith would have more thoughts on the US context for how to influence the narratives and the dominant ideas about agriculture here.
I think it's still an uphill battle. I think it's coming, but like you said, not fast enough. And we've been talking about it for 60 years, right? Or more. It's finally the conversation is finally mainstream, at least.
Yeah. Well, there are a lot of sort of interesting thoughts in the chat, in the Q&A, and one suggesting that you, Rodell, look at the triple bottom line. The data you've got on economics is phenomenal, but the social and environmental costing out this, especially when we talk about externalities, which you mentioned, associated with the chemical side, is a suggestion here, which, triple bottom line, looking at economics and social impacts and health, and I think are all different ways of characterizing, right, the problem we're suffering under, and then, using that as leverage perhaps to affect a transition. One of the problems we have now, and I really do want to shift to grassroots change, because that's sort of where we come from, where we dabble in regulatory decision making. We've served on the NOSB alongside Jeff, and so we get the importance of those institutions to help classify problems, gives you a voice to critique limitations, advance changes. But I like the theme in your work, Dr. Bezner Kerr, and it's in yours as well, embedded in your work too, at Rodell, Dr. Smith, the idea that a lot of these changes are going to come from the grassroots. And maybe that is where we need to ask our colleagues and our partner organizations to focus their resources, rather than, the efforts we spend to try to convince institutions that are maybe immovable. Having said that, some of these problems, there's a question in the chat about drift in the Midwest from Dicamba, which goes to the question of what can an individual farmer do, or even an individual community, when the larger institutions are promoting practices that cause indiscriminate poisoning, that is uncontrollable by individual action. So there is this balancing act that we have to advance, but somehow, at least in our work, we feel that if we can build momentum at the local level to embrace what you guys are talking about, which would change buying patterns, it would change, who gets elected to office. If they don't embrace everything you said today, then they should be unelectable, because we want them to bring that message to their elected positions, right? We can change what we do on the land we own as part of local public government, right? So do you see that as a strategy, which, I think is embedded in your work, Dr. Bezner Kerr? I mean, that's so much of what you
I think it's a bit of both, right? I mean, I think social movements and community-based efforts are really essential in this strategy, because I mean, certainly my own work, that's where we've seen great impact, and it also builds momentum and encouragement for people to say, oh, there really are alternatives that work out there. But then I think to really shift the system, we have to influence the broader national and state level policies that are going in the opposite direction. We know that subsidies, the vast majority of subsidies from the government are supporting conventional industrial agriculture and working against this, transformation of the system. So and many other ways, the education, agricultural extension. So it's a long list of policies and programs that are pushing in the opposite direction. So I think it has to be a bit of both.
Yeah,
I'd say for transitioning farmers to organic, it's almost 100% grass-based and relational. They don't listen to the presentation I just gave, and a farmer goes, "Oh, geez, yeah, I'm going to be organic now." They talk to their neighbor and they see what their neighbor's doing, and we see this. You can see wherever there's a good long-time organic farmer, you see this whole network of farmers around them, and then this whole oasis where there's no organic farmers. And we've started regional resource centers for that reason. If you look at Pennsylvania, we're second or third in total organic sales, farm sales, but we're not second or third in almost any category of other farm sales. And if we look, and we think it's because Rodale's been here for 70, 80 years. If you look at other states like Wisconsin and California that have a long-term organic research program, and Washington State as well, you see that there's a high concentration of organic farmers where that's occurred. There's a really good paper by Penn State economist Edward Janicki. You can probably find it on the Organic Trade Association website, where they look at hotspots and the benefit of economic benefits of these concentrated areas of organic farms. But that's why we've started to branch out and have centers in different states, because we think the farmers need to come and see and talk to people before they're really going to make what's really an important life decision.
Yeah. And thanks for bringing that up. I was told as a young person many years ago that the best way to talk to farmers is through field days, and have them visit your organic farm and have that conversation farmer to farmer. So that, I think that's an incredibly important point you're making. Well, I want to really thank you. Part of what we're trying to do with our work here, and hopefully we will continue the collaboration, is give people information that empowers action, so that they learn about what you're doing with agroecology or with organic, and they come upon a new paper that provides justification for the transition, and that becomes a tool for advocacy, that this data, the science, the experience becomes the information that informs a change. And it is grassroots for us, but it is also influencing institutions that have dramatic impact on our lives vis-a-vis laws and regulations. So we can't thank you enough for the work you're doing, your clarity of presentation, and your dedication, commitment to this work is indeed life-saving. And so we just have to ramp it up, and we have to get out there and make sure that all this knowledge is applied with the change that's needed. So hopefully we'll continue to do that. And again, thanks again for all your work and your participation in this particular seminar. Take care.
Thanks very
Paul.
much.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Bye-bye.
thanks, Trey. Thanks, everybody.